Former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has died at the age of 84 from complications of COVID. Over 4 decades in government, he was the country's first black national security advisor and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Our correspondent Nathan King looks back on his legacy.
In an otherwise glittering career spanning decades in the U.S. military and later in the White House, Colin Powell will also be remembered for a few short minutes in early 2003 in a now infamous speech he gave as U.S. Secretary of State in front of the United Nations Security Council.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
That vial of simulated anthrax powder he held up and his presentation of a highly manipulated case for war against Iraq was a moment he and the United States would come to regret. Colin Powell, up until that fateful moment, was the embodiment of the American dream, but he rose through the ranks, becoming a highly decorated general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, national security advisor, serving both Republican and Democratic presidents, and then the first African-American U.S. Secretary of State.
It is a great honor for me to submit the name to the United States Senate of Colin L. Powell as Secretary of State.
As the highest-ranking military officer during the first Gulf War, he would famously say that if the U.S. decided to go to war, then it should use overwhelming military force. Later, he invoked the so-called Pottery Barn principle. If you break it, he said, you own it. That doctrine and the presentation of false intelligence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction would come to haunt him in later life. He later spoke of his regrets in pushing the case for war as U.S. Secretary of State under George W. Bush, claiming faulty intelligence.
So yes, I was more than embarrassed. I was mortified, because even though the president had used the same information, Congress had used the same information, Secretary Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, all of us were using the same information, but I'm the one who made the biggest presentation of it.
After leaving office, he also changed his political stripes. Having pushed the case for war for a Republican president, he publicly backed Democrat Barack Obama for president. He also voted for Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, and in his twilight years became part of the Republican resistance against Donald Trump. Earlier this year, Powell said he was no longer a Republican. Colin Powell will be remembered in the U.S. as a great American, a trailblazing African-American leader, but fatefully also as a member of an inner circle that helped propel the U.S. into another disastrous war in the Middle East. Tragically, Colin Powell succumbed to consequences of COVID-19. He was fully vaccinated, but a cancer diagnosis left his immune system open to this most destructive of viruses. Like hundreds of thousands of other Americans, he has succumbed to a very real disease, not perceived threats that prove false from outside the country. And in the battle against COVID-19, the US is also finding it very difficult to win the war. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the White House.